Welcome to the deep dive on historic tax credits. You know the drill. We are well into our deep dive series of 2022, so I'm going to start just with some housekeeping, and then I'll turn it over to our experts today, Ryan Durant and Corey Leon. So here we go. The deep dive series is a part of our Developer Academy program. We have one session of the Developer Academy coming to you this fall. Looks like most of the folks on here are folks who've already been through the Developer Academy, but if you know anyone who's interested, we're always excited to share more information about the program and get more development happening in Eastern Omaha. Today's session is historic tax credits. As I said before, Ryan Durant and Corey Leon are going to be guiding us through that. We do have a whole host of other sessions online for the rest of the year, including our in-person Let's Look at a Lot deep dive, which is next month. We'll be convening at our Fabric Lab space in North Omaha, walking around the neighborhood, taking a look at some lots, and then heading back to the lab to run through DOGIS, see what's possible, what things are zoned as, and then actually run through a few financial scenarios. So if you're desperate for human connection and you want to get together with your Developer Academy peers, that's going to be a great one to sign up for. So check those out. You can find all registrations for all of these online on our website. Lastly, I just want to give a shout out and a thanks to our partners at the National Development Council and Freddie Mac. This program wouldn't be possible without these partnerships. So please share the love and say thank you to them when you see them. We are so excited to have the National Development Council here with us today. I see a few NDC folks on the call. Thank you so much for your partnership and for helping us bring this to life here in Omaha. All right, I'm going to stop my share and going to turn it over to Ryan, who's going to start us off by introducing himself, why he's here, and then sharing a little bit about a project that he has going in Nebraska. So Ryan, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is exciting to be part of this group. I know you guys are out there doing some great things, and Angela just asked that I share something I've been working on since 2019. Yeah, it's been an interesting couple of years as we've tried to get this project out of the ground with COVID and everything else. So the project we're going to talk about is the Lofts at 505 in Fremont, Nebraska. It's 28 apartments, and we have some commercial space, and we'll get into that here. So let's see. So kind of just to give you a quick overview, you know, this historic tax credit program incentivizes the redevelopment of historic properties. We have a federal credit, and then there's also the Nebraska state credit. We utilize both of these. Some of you may or may not know that the Nebraska state credit actually sunsets at the end of this year. So if you have any historic projects that you're thinking about moving forward with, if you can get those part twos submitted, you'll be safe and getting a state credit, which will definitely help your project. I talked to somebody this morning who's a pretty big lobbyist for the program and was instrumental in getting it set up. He stated that a senator has said that they will make this a priority to get this back to the legislature next year. So there's a good chance that it sunsets at the end of this year, but comes back probably the middle of next year. So just keep that in mind if you're working on existing historic deals here in Nebraska. The next thing I would tell you is to get an experienced team, and that includes, you know, your contractor, architects, legal, accounting, investors. As much as I'd love to tell you that I know it all, you really do need a team to get these things done. There's just so many moving parts when it comes to structuring these projects. The other thing, getting the credits, you need to apply and be approved before you can start anything. And so there is a process to that, and it does take some time. So, I would plan on, anywhere from 6 to 12 months getting through that. So that can be time consuming. So just keep that in the back of your head as you're working on anything you're looking at. Once basically you get the project placed in service, you will have a 5-year compliance that you're basically under the umbrella of historics, and so any changes would need to be approved by the state and national historic preservation offices. After the 5 years, you can pretty much do whatever you want, and so just keep that in mind.
Hey, Ryan, we had a question come in asking about the size of your team. And a lot of our folks are interested in that kind of, is it a formalized partnership? How does that work? And what does your team look like currently for this project?
Yeah, so on the Fremont project, we used Allie Pointer. The first kind of team member we brought on board was Allie Pointer, which is an architect group here out of Omaha. And obviously they spend a good bit of the work that they've done in historics. We felt that we needed, somebody that really understood historic tax credits and getting through the process. This building, the 505 building, was actually part of a district in downtown Fremont. So, that certainly helps the process. But, kind of what I've been told the rule is if you have a building that's about 50 years old, it should qualify for the historic tax credits, but you'll definitely want to verify that before you get too far down the road. So, the building, the 505 building, was built in the 1900s, and it was built originally as a bank, and then the upper floors were for professionals, attorneys, doctors, dentists, all kinds of professionals. So once we kind of got through, putting all the plans together, we took it out to bid, and we selected 3 different contractors that we wanted to bring in. And the contractor that we selected for this project was Lund Ross, who has done a number of historic rehabs throughout the area, and they're also the low bidder, so that helps in today's environment. On as far as legal, we used Brent Beller, who's done a lot of tax credit deals, and he helped us. We actually were talking to a big national syndicating group on the credits, but we found that the legal costs were pretty expensive and some of their other fees. So we actually ended up finding a local Nebraska bank that was going to buy the credits. And so it worked out pretty well to bring a local bank on board. It saved us some money on some of the third-party fees that we would have to pay otherwise, and especially for these smaller projects, they just can't absorb those costs. So that's why I think getting, somebody, that understands the tax credits from the legal and accounting standpoint really will help, make sure that you have a solid project that you can present to investors and get them to invest. So downtown Fremont, they had a housing study completed, and housing was definitely in need. They don't have a lot of housing down there. And so we decided that this building, which had been sitting vacant for 10 to 12 years, definitely needed some new life. And so, we felt with historic tax credits, it certainly was ideal. But I will tell you, it took some other sources to get the project done, which I'll kind of get into here. But I kind of wanted to give you a picture of, what the building was like. This is the 5th floor. And this is actually the only floor that was actually still intact, meaning all the other floors were demoed out. So they're pretty much a blank canvas, whereas this floor was basic. It's essentially how it was built back in the 1800s. You have marble wainscoting, you have the historic tile floor running down the hallway. You can see the woodwork and kind of where doors and windows and stuff were at for the offices. This floor is unique because, you know, it is the only floor that actually was still intact. So we have to keep it exactly like you see it. The other floors, again, were all demoed out, so they look more like this. So definitely don't have the same character as the fifth floor, but to recreate that would cost, you know, quite a bit of money. And so it'll still have the existing tile floors, historic floors as the fifth floor. It just won't have all the character with the wood and doors and windows and stuff. As you know, we're retrofitting a building that didn't have kitchens and bathrooms upstairs. So, you know, you run into now all of a sudden you have piping running down. So that was some cause for concern to the historic folks. Obviously, this is on the first floor commercial, and you have, you know, you have these beautiful ceilings that you don't want to lose to piping, but yet it creates some challenges in construction, you know, because these floors are about 2 feet of concrete and clay tile. You can't run them through the floors. We had to drop them down through the ceiling. And so kind of gives you another perspective of kind of what it looked. And so we were able to get the contractor in there and basically drop the ceiling. So now we have a finished ceiling that conceals the piping from upstairs. You know, I think that's probably one of the challenges, you know, you're going to run into on some of these historic deals is just trying to retrofit. And it's not going to be just all SHPO requirements. It's going to be code requirements between fire. It's probably the biggest one. We had to add a second set of egress. And so we did that on the exterior. Also put in a new elevator in the building, and sprinkler the entire building. So, you know, those are all things that, you know, depending on what size of project you're looking at, you'll have to consult, you know, with your architect and engineers to kind of get an idea on what you're looking at to bring the building up to today's standards. And that certainly is going to affect your budget. This is a layout of the second floor, which is the first floor of apartments. We have 7 units per floor, pretty efficient between studios and 1-beds. So we've got the 23 1-beds and 5 studios. And so 28 units all in. And so it created a nice kind of missing middle housing product for downtown Fremont. This is the 3rd floor, which is basically a little different just because of where the staircase is, comes up from the 1st floor to the 2nd floor, but essentially the units layout essentially the same all the way up, stack up. Just to kind of give you a breakdown, I mean, our studios, you know, they range, you know, around 500 square feet. We're getting about $795 in rent, and our 1-beds anywhere from $600 to $725, and $895 is kind of the rent on those. Amenities, secured access and resident lounge, on-site storage, and energy efficient units. So I'm trying to think, sources. This is kind of where hopefully it'll help once Corey starts going through his case studies and kind of we'll be able to understand this a little bit more moving, by the end of this presentation. But just to give you what our cost came in, we came in just right around 5 million in total construction costs. Our total development cost, which obviously is acquisition, all the fees, and then the other reserves and all the other stuff you need to get the project done, came just over 7 million. The city of Fremont actually gave us a loan through their LB 840 program. It's the $465,000 that as long as we keep it housing for 5 years, they will forgive that entire amount. And so that was something that came up due to COVID. We just ran into, all the cost increases, and so the city was gracious enough to work with us and make sure the project happened, and that got us over the hump. We also originally got the Greater Fremont Development Council gave us an interest-only loan, 2% for $600,000. And so that's what we used to do the acquisition, along with pay the architects and some of the other third-party costs that go into it. Owner equity, we came up, we had $600,000 owner equity that we had to put into the project. And then federal historic tax credit equity. So this amount here, the 1,100,000, that's net. So basically, I'm sure Corey will get into this more, but basically you'll take, whatever your budget is and look at your eligible basis, and 20% of that will be eligible for credits. And then you'll get a price on that. Again, we worked with a local Nebraska bank. And so, we were able to get around 80 cents on the dollar for that, and which is what you see there with the 1.1 million. And that comes in kind of tranches as we move forward with the project. Those dollars come in. So you get a little bit at closing, you get some at 50%, and then you get some once you hit some of the other milestones, which includes, completion and kind of stabilization. The state historic tax credits, same thing. You get, it's capped out at $1 million though. So basically of that $1 million, we got 75 cents on the dollar. So that's how we came to the 750. So if you took that out of the equation, that certainly creates, some issues for historic projects. But, obviously I feel comfortable that we'll get it back after this year, because I think it's a important tool to get these projects complete. And then we just had our conventional loan for the remainder of the 3.8 million is, basically what we were able to secure to get the project over the hump. So I know I went over a lot in a short amount of time, but I certainly wanted to kind of just give you an overview of what we did and how we did it in a very, very 30,000 foot level. So if there's some questions, I think Corey's going to go over a lot of good information. But I'm happy to kind of answer any questions about specifically kind of the 505 and what we saw on our end. And what I will tell you is that, every project's very unique. So just go into it knowing that, it's somewhat of a negotiation with the SHPO folks. And I don't know if anybody's online from SHPO, but, there just are some things that you can do and some things you can't do, just based on, I mean, if it works or doesn't work. And windows were another big thing that came back. You can't, we had over 200 windows in the 505, and you just can't run over to Menards and pick up a window and throw it in. We had a very specific profile that we had to hit, so we had to work specifically with the manufacturer. And so there is a cost to doing the credits. So just be aware. If you buy a building and it's got something in place already, you might be okay. But there's just a lot of variables that go into these buildings. And that's why I strongly encourage folks to do your due diligence and get a good team, because nobody likes surprises in these deals, because they can be very costly.
Hey, Ryan.
Yeah.
Can you backtrack for the group just a minute about how you started this project, not looking at historic tax credits, and how you circled around to incorporating that into the project in the building?
Yes. So originally we looked through the state through a grant for housing, and we were not awarded. And so then we kind of circled the wagons again with the city, and the city, felt very strongly about what we were proposing. So they said, we will help get you there. And so they kind of stepped in as a city versus a state. And then we knew that, we had to go after the credits, the historic tax credits, to kind of, keep it all, in line with what we wanted to accomplish. And so, again, we spent a lot of time and effort, over the years, and COVID certainly was a factor to us getting the project kicked off. We didn't kick it off until July of 2021, and from a construction standpoint, we're probably like 60 to 70% complete. We've got some tenants, signed up to move in like August or in September. So we're excited.
That's helpful for the group. I just think that's something to think about, because some developers are like, I do historic tax credit projects, and they specifically seek out those buildings. And in this case, you've got Ryan, who's like, I have a vision for what I want to redevelop this building into, and came to the historic tax credits because of the capital need, not necessarily because that's his specialty, working with historic tax credits.
Yeah, and that is accurate. I mean, basically, we kind of, once we started looking at the project, it just made sense to move over to the historic program. And so, yeah, it definitely has been a fun experience. There certainly has been challenges. I don't want to paint it as it's perfect, because it's not. No development is. So.
Thanks for that perspective. I was going to ask the same thing. And was LIHTC ever a consideration?
Yeah, I mean, we looked at anything and everything. And so the city, because I spend 90% of my time actually in LIHTC, and so I'm very familiar with the program. And I'll be honest, I think for downtown Fremont, we just felt pretty strongly that the missing middle kind of workforce housing was a huge need. And so we thought this was better suited for not going through LIHTC, but we certainly did. I have some numbers saved, performa saved, running it as LIHTC, but, I think the city stepping up and doing what they did, and the Greater Fremont Development Council kind of was the difference between us going through LIHTC and not going through LIHTC. So
I think that's a great example of how important those relationships are that you have with city folks. I mean, that's amazing that they came with the money that you needed to fill that gap. That's unheard of.
Yeah, it truly was. I can tell you this was a priority for them. They felt very strongly. There was a housing study done in 2012 that called the 505 building a catalyst to the revitalization of downtown. I felt, that was, very accurate. And so we've actually seen some exciting things, happen over the last 6 to 8 months. And I think there's going to, be some other things happening here shortly. I'm excited for Fremont. I think they decided this was an investment. They just didn't want to see it sitting around any longer. The other thing I should talk about a little bit real quick is we were able to utilize what's called the VIP program. And that's just for historic properties. It's state statute. So essentially, we're able to freeze our real estate taxes as they're currently assessed. And I think we're currently assessed around 300,000. So we'll freeze our taxes on this property for 8 years. And then after year 8, it goes up 25% until year 13, we'll be paying 100% of what we should be assessed at. It's kind of the reverse of TIF if you think about it. Instead of going out and getting TIF loan, we're kind of just able to freeze the taxes and pick up a little bit more in our conventional loan.
Did you have to do an application for that?
So yes, it is part of the process when you're going through and doing your part 1 and part 2. It's a separate form, and so you'll want to keep that in mind as you're moving forward with your project. So
I think you can do that on any historic property that is that you're providing rehabilitation on. So if it's already on the historic register, and what it basically does is the state pays that difference to the county. So it's not, I don't think it's lost revenue to the county. I'm not positive about that, but I was thinking it's the way that operates. But it required a constitutional amendment to the state's constitution to do that. So that was a pretty big move. So I'm glad you were able to take advantage of that, Ryan. That's going to be a big part of being able to
it was definitely
cash flow the property.
Yeah, it was a big deal. And honestly, Fremont's not a real big TIF community. I will say that I had a conversation with the superintendent who kind of drives that bus a little bit for the community, and we talked about that. Obviously, these are studios and 1 bed, so it's not going to be a real big burden on the school. So he said he could look past the 505 for TIF if we needed it. But the VIP program was an easy process, really, and it just made a lot of sense to utilize it. So
I just was going to mention this for a little more on the building locally. How long was it empty, Ryan? I think it was, oh gosh, a very long time. This owner had it. And I know that the city leaders were like, we just need, he'd keep like almost selling it, or somebody'd have an idea and just decide, nah, not ready to sell it yet. So it was really very instrumental to the community, even just transferring that ownership, so that, it's a bonus to them that it's, actually being developed, because it really is like a very prominent building in their downtown, to just not have anything occurring there.
Yeah, and in fact, there was quite a few Omaha developers that had looked at it over the years, and so I will not take credit for being the smartest one. I think I was just, it's all about luck and timing, and I think the city, we were fortunate to be in a good position that we could get site control, and then the city said okay, because it wasn't like it was a building listed. It just had come up through conversation that there might be an opportunity to buy the building. And so, again, it's just really kind of timing and luck, I think, on my part, because there was some Omaha developers that are much smarter than I am that looked at it and couldn't figure it out. But, again, I think a city had heard, enough that this project wasn't getting done, that they said, they finally decided they needed to help get it over the hump. So that was the again, my luck. So
you undersell. But I am glad that you admit and acknowledge that timing has a big role in any sort of development project. Are there any other questions for Ryan about this project specifically? If it's about historic tax credits in general, I'll say hold those until after Corey's done, because he may answer your question in his presentation. But any other questions for Ryan? All right, thank you so much for your time, Ryan. We're gonna end your screen share and Corey is going to take the wheel. Take us away, Corey.
Okay, let me try to share my screen, make sure that's working. So can everyone see the lecture notes?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so why are we here? Well, most of you have gone through the Development Academy, so you know a little bit about real estate finance, and oftentimes there's a gap. And so federal and state rehab tax credits are a way of helping to fill that gap, but they're not quite as powerful as, say, the low-income housing tax credit, the LIHTC. So federal and state rehab tax credits can cover around 25 to 35% of a project's financing. So that's the net number. The federal credit's a 20% in total credit, as well as the state credit, which is 20%. So in total, after you net out fees and so forth, you're probably going to net somewhere in that 25 to 35% range. But to understand or to utilize this development tool, you really have to understand the rules of the program and also take a look at your project and determine whether it's a good fit or not. Not every project is a good fit because you do have to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards for historic rehabilitation. And sometimes if a building's very ornate or has some features to it, it can get very, very expensive very, very quickly. So for example, in the photo of a project that we participated in Memphis, those second floor curved glass windows can be, very, very expensive, particularly to replace. It's probably better to try to repair something like that. But, if the building was full of those curved glass windows, then it might not actually be a good candidate. It might be better to actually do a different treatment on the windows, something that's more affordable. So you do have to look at each building project by project. So, why are we going to go through the brain damage of having both our state historic preservation office and the National Park Service look through our architectural plans? Well, because oftentimes projects just don't happen without some sort of public assistance. So, it could be that the lenders see an unacceptable level of risk in the project, or investors see that there's inadequate return on their investment. And so sometimes we really need these types of programs in order to make a project go forward. And we have to keep in mind that, investors have lots of options in which and where to invest in their money. So, they're seeking the maximum economic benefits and trying to minimize their equity investment. So they're going to seek projects yielding the highest return on investment. We also have to keep in mind that not all investors can utilize rehab tax credits. So federal rehab tax credits are a passive income tax credit. And you have to have enough passive income in order to utilize the credit. Passive income is in part income related to real estate, as opposed to active income. Active income is income related to your job and anything that you do, more than half of the year that you actively participate in is considered your active income. So, and there's limited use against active income. Now, I know if there's a few of you here that probably qualify as real estate professionals. For those of you that do, and that's something that you want to talk with your accountant about, the IRS recognizes that there is no difference between passive income for you and active income, because your active income comes from a passive activity. So for you, that's good news, and that you can use passive income tax credits against your active income. But if you don't work as a real estate professional, or you work for someone else, so let's say that you are employed by a developer, then actually your active income is active income. You don't qualify for that real estate professional status. So there are lots of reasons why entities can't use all of the passive income tax credits that they're going to generate. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, how we get around that issue. We also have to keep in mind that, from a lender's perspective, lenders are already risk limiters. Lending's already a low margin, high volume business. And so by their very nature, historic projects are not cookie cutter projects. Everyone has nuances, and nuances take extra time. They take extra time to understand. And so if you're a loan officer with a quota to make in terms of the number of loans that you're going to do in a year, then you have to figure out where the best use of your time is. And so sometimes just trying to attract loans for these types of projects can be difficult. We also have to keep in mind that, construction lenders, there are probably two different types of lenders that we're going to be dealing with, a construction lender and a permanent lender. And so, and they have slightly different concerns here. Construction lenders are always concerned about completion. And so one of the things that they're going to be looking at is the adequacy of the budget. And since this is the rehabilitation tax credit, we're rehabbing buildings, and there's a lot of unknown conditions with rehab. Particularly when you're digging into systems, when you're trying to determine, what's in the plaster, what's behind the plaster. There's a lot that can go on with a historic rehab deal. So one of the things that they're going to be looking for is sufficient construction contingency. And I'd say for an RTC project, you really want to see a construction contingency of at least 10%. If you have a lot of things like curved windows, curved doorways, plaster, moldings, things like that, you may want to increase that construction contingency even higher. The other things that the construction lender is going to be concerned about is your team's ability to get the project from start to finish. So your strength and capability as a developer and the strength and capability of your general contractor. You know, they're not going to want to see a general contractor that has only done new construction. Right? That is a very different skill set than dealing with rehab. And frankly, I think it's a different skill set doing regular rehab versus historic rehab. So, you know, hopefully you can find a general contractor that has solid experience in historic rehab. And then in terms of the developers, you know, they're going to be looking to see if there's a paid developer fee that can be used as a secondary source of contingency. A lot can go wrong in these projects. And so having backup sources is always something that the construction lender is going to be looking for. We also have to keep in mind that we are probably going to be asking the construction lender for more than the permanent lender, mainly because it is often the construction lender that ends up bridging our rehab tax credit equity. You don't get the tax credits until you place the building into service, but you need the money up front. You need the money during construction. So someone has to come up with that money, and it's often our construction lender that is that source of the bridge financing. So they're often even taking more risk than they'd like to because of that need to bridge the equity. Now, in terms of permanent lenders, one of the issues that permanent lenders have is that a foreclosure during the compliance period for the federal historic tax credit is a recapture event. And so most investors will want some sort of forbearance on the permanent lender's ability to foreclose during the 5-year compliance period. And so, and if the permanent lender is not willing to give that, then sometimes you can go with a higher operating reserve. But so there are different ways around this issue, but it is an issue. You have to keep in mind that the lender is very, very concerned about foreclosure because they've probably already invested all the equity with you, but they have 5 years in which to obtain the tax credits that they've already paid you for. And so that's a really big issue. So I'm not going to talk, I talked a little bit about the types of income, but basically we have to keep in mind that federal RTCs are passive. And so in order to take a tax credit, a passive income tax credit, it has to offset other passive income. So income from either the real estate that the tax credit was taken on or other real estate that you as the developer may own. Or since corporations don't recognize the difference between active and passive income, one of the reasons why we often bring a corporate investor into our deal is that we can assign this normally passive income tax credit to the corporation, and the corporation can use the full thing. So for this this little mini session here, we're going to talk about just the tax benefit of tax credits. We're not going to talk about cash flow or appreciation. So I talked about passive losses. Mainly, it can be used by investors with substantial passive income or non-closely held corporations. Those are the main two people that can use passive losses. Real estate professionals can use passive losses against their active income, and there's also the small investor rule as well. So when we talk about the rehabilitation tax credit, we should first talk about what is a tax credit. So a tax credit is a dollar for dollar offset of taxes. So if I have a dollar tax credit and I have $10 of tax liability, then I, in essence, only have to pay $9 of my tax liability because the tax credit took care of one of the dollars. So there are three types. We're focusing this session on rehabilitation tax credits, but there are others out there. So rehab tax credits are basically used to turn historic buildings, mainly used to renovate historic buildings. It can be any sort of historic building as long as the new use is tax paying. So that could be any sort of private activity. Governments cannot use historic tax credits, and nonprofits can't own and operate a building and get historic tax credits. However, nonprofits can be a lessee in a historic tax credit project. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. It's a 5-year credit. You get 4% each year for 5 years. So that's a total of 20%. You can actually apply multiple times in the life of a building. So as long as you meet the program requirements, you can get tax credits every time you meet the requirements. It does, though, decrease your depreciable basis, which means that you get to take less off your taxes as you own the building. And it also decreases your adjusted basis, which means that you end up paying a little bit more capital gains tax. And being a passive income credit, it can offset an unlimited amount of passive income, but only a limited amount of active income. And the building, like I said, must be held for 5 years in its approved rehab status to avoid recapture. So there are two main ways that recapture happens. One is foreclosure, right? That there's some sort of transfer of ownership, either voluntary or involuntary transfer of ownership during the 5 years that would cause a recapture event. Or something catastrophic happens to the building where it can't be restored to its rehab status. So you have a wood frame building, the building completely burns to the ground. There's no way of rehabilitating it because there's no building left. Not only have you lost your building, but you also lose your credits. So, and there is a way of insuring over that. So we'll, something important to keep in mind. In order to qualify, the building must be a certified historic structure or a contributing building in a National Register historic district. What's the difference between the two? Well, this certified historic structure is kind of the gold standard. That means that there is something historic about that building. And it's not just an age issue. Just because a building's 50 years old does not mean that necessarily it's historic. There has to be a person, an event, a construction style, a material used, an architect, some factor that makes this building unique or historic. So, it could be, well, they say that, for example, Eleanor Roosevelt helped make more historic hotels, more little hotels in tiny towns across America historic than any other person in history, because during the New Deal, her husband could not travel. So it was her responsibility to go out and sell the New Deal across the country. And so she did a whistle stop tour. Every town that was near the railroad, she would go stop at the stop, talk about the New Deal, usually stay at the local hotel. And oftentimes her speeches were from the balcony of that hotel. And so, that event, that important event in US history, is what makes that historic hotel historic. Now, the contributing building on a National Register historic district is kind of the secondary criteria. And in that case, the buildings as a collection convey a time or place in American history. So think about the town square, with the courthouse in the middle. Have you ever seen any of the Back to the Future movies? That kind of iconic government building in the center, traditional commercial buildings with first floor retail, upper floor residential surrounding it. Right? That gives a sense of a period in American history. So in that case, maybe none of the buildings themselves are significant individually, but as a collection, they convey that sense of time or place. The property must be depreciable property, meaning that it can be commercial, industrial, or rental housing property, but it must be income property. It cannot be owner-occupied residential property. Owner-occupied residential property is not depreciable and therefore does not qualify for the federal program. A lot of state programs allow owner-occupied properties, residential properties to qualify, but the federal does not. You have to be doing what's called a substantial rehabilitation, which is either the greater of $5,000 or the property's adjusted basis. And we'll talk about the adjusted basis in a second. I've never done a project where we were relying on the $5,000 test. It's almost always the adjusted basis. That $5,000 test has never been adjusted. And so, that is an extremely low level. Typically, your adjusted basis, especially if you just recently purchased the property, is your purchase price. So I purchased a property for $100,000. I have to spend at least $100,000 in renovation costs in order to qualify for the program. Now, if I spend $1 million on rehab, I get to take the credit on the full $1 million, but I have to at least make that threshold first. And I'm going to be following the Secretary of Interior standards as administered by the National Park Service and your state Historic Preservation Office. So not every project is a good candidate for the rehab tax credit. Now, the lucky thing is that we are looking at preservation, not restoration, right? This does not have to be a museum quality restoration of the building. This is, to try to make the building functional, economically functional. So we're trying to preserve as much as we can, but also keeping the building functional. So the exterior considerations are probably number one, windows, right? Windows are a big part of a building's facade. They help define the character of a building, and therefore a lot of attention is spent on those windows. You have to look at look out for curved or unusual doorways, because again, trying to preserve those things can be very expensive. We have to be careful of facade changes or trying to restore old facades. For example, one of the things I see a lot is buildings in the 60s and 70s where they tried to modernize them by putting the, what we would consider today fairly ugly metal siding, sometimes not corrugated, but kind of squared off metal siding to cover the building, cover the facade. Well, depending on what was done to the facade that was originally there, you may or may not be able to restore it. And so that building may actually lose its historic designation because the historic facade was destroyed in the process of putting that modernization up. Sometimes you can take that off, do a little bit of restoration, and get the building to qualify. Building additions can be an issue. You do not get the historic tax credit on outbuildings and landscaping, so you have to keep that in mind, but you may have to renovate them. So that can be a real issue. I worked on a project that had an old smokestack because it had its own power plant, and the smokestack was an outbuilding. We had to renovate the smokestack, even though it was in bad shape and everyone wanted to tear it down, but it was considered part of the whole, and therefore it was determined that it had to be saved. And then we want to also look at things like security and environmental issues. All of those things play into the considerations for restoration. But it's not just the exterior. When you're dealing with the rehab tax credit, the interior is also subject to review. So the most critical areas are public areas. So foyers, hallways, if at all possible, they want the building to feel like it did when it was during its period of significance. So they, as much as possible, would like you to preserve those public areas. So Ryan had to preserve that one hallway that was original. The other hallways that had been destroyed, he didn't have to restore. Again, this is preservation. This is not restoration. We're not trying to do a museum quality restoration of the building. And typically the sins of the previous owner do not have to be necessarily rectified by you. However, if the changes were so extensive, for example, putting, a facade over the original facade and destroying the original facade, you may lose out on being considered historic anymore. So it can be that bad. But typically, for example, if the windows had been replaced with non-historic windows by the previous owner, you're not obligated to replace those windows with new windows, only if the windows were in bad shape. We have to be very considerate of interior configuration issues for reuse. So for example, with old school buildings, old school buildings have very wide hallways because they're trying to accommodate a bunch of kids changing classes at once. But from a practical standpoint, that's wasted space. That's not being leased to anyone. So most developers would much rather squeeze those hallways down into a 3-foot or 4-foot hallway rather than the 6 or 8 foot that they may be currently. But again, we need to try to keep those public areas in good shape. Same thing with special purpose spaces, auditoriums, churches, gymnasiums. It can be very difficult to get changes to those spaces approved. And so we need to keep that in mind as we proceed with these, and start a discussion early with the State Historic Preservation Office to see if there are ways that you can get a project to go forward. And then, of course, as Ryan had suggested, there are sometimes challenges where you have a life safety demand. On the one hand, maybe the fire department is requiring something, but on the other hand, the State Historic Preservation Office wants something preserved or doesn't want something changed. That's again where give yourself some time for that negotiation. There is likely a solution in there someplace, but it may take you time to figure it out. So it is extremely important to understand the challenges the project may face prior to the project start. It is so worth hiring a consultant or an architect that has done rehab tax credit projects before, not just worked on historic buildings, right? That's not enough. It is really experience in working with the tax credit program that's the key. So how to mitigate, really understand for yourself the emphasis placed on public areas and the review process. They're going to want to look at the exterior of the building. They're going to definitely want to look at the public spaces within the interior. And typically, stuff that is beyond the public space, like, Ryan's converting that hallway look that was a traditional office hallway. What's happening, beyond the doorways are going to be residential units. So there's a lot less emphasis placed on those spaces as placed on the public places. And so, also don't necessarily rely on the fact that your local historic district has approved your plans. Oftentimes their criteria are much less rigorous than the national standards for historic preservation. And so I've seen plenty of times where people have literally ordered their windows. They then decide to go for historic tax credits and their application is denied, and they're confused because, well, my local historic designation, my local historic district commission approved my windows. That doesn't mean that was met the criteria for the tax credits. So the tax credit is a three-part process. Part one basically establishes that the building is historic. So if it's already historic, then you're basically just in the part one, citing that it's historic, citing when it was made historic, and showing that there hasn't been such radical changes particularly to the exterior of the building, that it's no longer historic. But if the building is not on the National Register, then you're going to submit your part one application, and the SHPO then makes a recommendation to the National Park Service, and the National Park Service can certify the building as historic. This process, though, can easily be 9 to 12 months. So it's not something that you want to wait till the last minute on. You want to try to get this done early. And again, a consultant that has a lot of experience in this can be worth their weight in gold. Now, the second part is probably the hardest, and that is the architectural review. It is the detailed plans and specifications of what you're going to be doing to the building. And this is backed up by both drawings and photo documentation. So, if I'm renovating my office, maybe I take a photo from the corner of my office that has the door in it. And then that's showing what the existing conditions is for the part 2. For my part 3, I'm going to take a similar photo, a post renovation photo from the same spot, so that there's a before and an after photo. So basically in part 2, you're telling the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service what you're planning to do for the building. And in part 3, that is what you actually did to the building. And in both cases, you want to follow it up with photo documentation. Another thing to check is sometimes the review times on these can be quite lengthy. So I've seen cases where your State Historic Preservation Office can get behind on work. And we faced a situation in Michigan a few years ago where it was 6 months before the SHPO was even going to look at your plans. And so keep that in mind as well. Hopefully that never happens in Nebraska, but again, that consultant, that historic architect that does this all the time will know these things and can help you prepare in the future for them. So what are the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation? So in summary, there are 10 requirements. One is that you have a compatible use, a compatible new use. Most uses can be compatible, but there may be uses that would not be compatible. That you're going to preserve the historic character of the building. That you not create a false sense of history. So for example, Ryan had mentioned needing to add a second means of egress to the building, and he had to put a building addition onto the building, probably with maybe either a set of stairs or a set of stairs, and that's where the elevator is going. Rather than making that building addition look exactly like the original building, the State Historic Preservation Office would probably much rather have the building look distinctly modern. Right? They want a casual observer of the building to be able to tell what's historic and what's new. They want you to preserve changes that have gained significance over time. So maybe your building was built in the 1700s, but it had a major renovation in the late 1800s. So that late 1800 renovation may have gained its own significance. They want you to preserve distinctive features. They want you to repair rather than replace. And that's an important one. They'd much rather have you repair the windows than replace the windows. And that goes for not just windows, but for pretty much everything. They don't want you to cause any further damage to the building. If there are any architectural resources, you're supposed to protect them. They want those new additions to be compatible, but they also want additions to be removable. So for example, spray foam insulation is extremely hard to remove. So therefore, they would much prefer you to use something like blown-in insulation, which can be removed. Just in case we find out sometime later that spray foam insulation causes damage to the building, for you to try to remove that is probably going to cause further damage to the building. So they want you to always keep in mind that whatever you do to the building especially if you're adding something new, that new addition can be removed. So I had mentioned the substantial rehabilitation test, which is basically that you exceed your adjusted basis in the building. So basically, the test is that the cost of rehabilitation exceeds your adjusted basis within either a 24-month period or a 60-month period under an approved application. What's the difference between the 24-month or the 60-month? It's basically whether you're doing a phased project. If you're doing a phased project, then you get a 60-month time frame to meet the adjusted basis. There is no penalty if you meet the adjusted basis test early, but there's a major penalty if you don't meet the adjusted basis within the 24 months. You're not allowed to go back and change that and adjust that on your application. So do yourself a favor and figure out how to phase your project, right? Figure out some reasonable phasing schedule in order to get your project to be a 60-month adjusted basis project. There's been too many times where I've seen some sort of disruption, right? Think about all the projects happening during COVID where they had only hit the 24-month box on their application, but suddenly COVID strikes, all construction is shut down for a year. So if they had not already made their adjusted basis test, they were really faced with a problem. And we're seeing the same thing right now with construction supply disruption. So again, phase your project, give yourself the 60-month period. Once you meet the test disappears. And so, like I said, there's no penalty if you get the 60-month period, but then you achieve your basis test in the first month, there's no penalty for that. What do you get to include in your tax credit itself? Well, you get to include all costs incurred prior to the test period. So if you've owned this building theoretically for 80 years, you could take all of the costs since ownership. Problem is, how would you prove that they're historic and been approved, let alone find receipts and all of that? But in theory, it's costs incurred prior to the test period, costs incurred during the test period, so the 2 years or the 5-year period, and costs incurred after the test period through the end of the year in which the test period ends. So another little trick that we often try to do is we try to end our test period in a January. And you get to determine your test period. You get to tell the IRS what 24-month or 60-month period you're using. So if you can, make that test period end in early in the year so that you get to count all of your expenses through the end of the year in your basis. So what is our basis? Well, our basis is our original project cost. And then if we've owned it for a while, it's our new capital expenditures. But if we've taken any tax depreciation, we have to subtract that off. And if we've amortized any fees, we have to take that off. And if we've ever had a previous federal RTC, we have to take that off of our basis as well. So that's our adjusted basis. Now, what if you have a government tenant? So you cannot use RTCs only if both of these things apply. So if more than 50% of the space is occupied by a government or a nonprofit, and you're in a disqualified lease. So if my nonprofit is occupying 25% of my space, I have no problem, right? If my nonprofit is occupying 75% of the space, but the lease is not a disqualified lease, then I don't have a problem. I can still use RTCs. It's only if both of these things apply. And sometimes you'll go to conferences and you'll hear people kind of freaking out about having a government or a tax exempt tenant. But in fact, it's fairly easy to still be able to use the program. So what is a disqualified lease? So it's if any of these things apply. So if the project's financed with tax exempt debt issued by a tax exempt tenant. So you have a government, they're financing the project through tax exempt bonds, for example. If the tenant's lease is for more than 19 years, I'm sorry, more than 20 years. So if I have a 19-year lease, I'm fine. If a tenant was a previous owner of the property, and really, I think, well, there's not great guidance on this right now. The IRS seems to be interpreting this as a tenant was a previous owner and occupant of the property. So I've worked with some nonprofits over the years that maybe had a building donated to them. They've owned the building for a while. They haven't used it, and so it's just sat vacant. Finally, they raised enough money to take on a project or something like that. Simply because they were a previous owner of the property does not necessarily seem to disqualify them. It's only if they were really a user of the property. And this last one applies to all RTC projects, whether it's a government or tax exempt tenant or not. If the lease specifies a fixed or determinable purchase price or an option to buy, then that is no longer considered leased property. It's considered owner-occupied property, and therefore the entire deal can fall apart. So lots of these deals, they start out as residential rental, and maybe the developer wants to eventually turn them into condos and sell them. Well, in the lease documents, you can have a right to buy the unit, but it must be a right to buy the unit at fair market value at the time of sale, right? You can't have any mention of a fixed price or any sort of formula or anything like that in there that would give a sense of what the price is today. The IRS considers that you have basically sold the property, and it's a sham lease if you have that within your lease. So just avoid that completely. You can have a right to buy, but there can't be a fixed or determinable price in doing so. So how do I figure out how much tax credits I'm eligible for? Well, we can basically include all costs that are part of our depreciable basis, except for anything related to building acquisition, new construction, and site improvements. So that means that basically all of my rehab costs, all of my interim costs, such as my construction loan fee, my property taxes during construction, my insurance during construction, my A&E fees, my builder, my contractor, my developer fees, appraisal fees, all of those things that are consumed during construction can be counted for your basis. And there's NDC's project cost summary worksheet, which is a good basis for that, or the development tab on the NDC spreadsheet that Angela has put into the chat are both good sources for you to take a look at. In the end, it's going to be probably your project accountant that will help you determine exactly how much of this can be put into your RTC basis. But most things that are consumed during construction count for your qualified rehabilitation expenses. So things to exclude: acquisition costs. You don't get credit for buying the building, only rehabbing the building. No new construction and nothing related to new construction. So let's say that you have 10% of your project costs are related to new construction, 90% are related to rehabilitation, then 10% of your architect fees must be excluded. 10% of your property taxes during construction must be excluded, right? So it's a ratio of the two. So it's not only the construction issues, but it's all soft costs related to construction that are also impacted. You don't get the RTC on site improvements. It's the rehabilitation of a building that qualifies. And you don't get the rehab tax credits on any intangible assets, things like reserves, your permanent loan fees, your marketing, pre-opening marketing expenses, anything in which you would amortize rather than depreciate. So why do we go through the brain damage of doing this? Well, we're trying to raise equity. So if we have $1 million rehab, our total credit is 20%. Remember, 4% a year for 5 years. So 4% times 5 is 20%. So for my $1 million rehab, I may be able to generate $200,000 of rehab tax credits. And if I'm able to bring in an investor who is willing to invest 85 cents for every dollar that they receive, then I can generate $170,000 in equity for my project. So then, okay, I've now earned myself $170,000 of tax credits. How do I actually use them? How do I turn them into cash? Well, first of all, I can reduce it. I can use it to reduce taxes on other passive income from the project itself, or passive income on other projects that I may own. If I'm a small investor, I can use up to $25,000 of passive losses on my active income, but I have to qualify as a small investor. Or I can carry it forward and carry it back. Now, Nebraska has its own state tax credit program. The Nebraska tax credit offsets the state income tax liability. We have to keep in mind that state credits generally have lower value than federal credits. There's two reasons for that. One is that state credits end up being federally taxable. And two, there's just not as many buyers out there that need state credits. So typically there's a little bit less competition, and therefore the prices tend to be a little bit lower for state historic credits. So, and we're not doing Great Plains. So there is a case within the casebook, and Angela put the casebook in the chat, called South Street Apartments. And what you'll need for South Street Apartments is the NDC spreadsheet that Angela also put in the chat. What I'd like everyone to do is to read that that case study, and South Street Apartments is nice in that it only involves the development budget. What we're mainly focusing in this case is, how do we figure out what is the maximum amount of tax credits I can attract to my project and the maximum equity that I can attract to my project. So Angela, were you going to do this as breakout groups or just have everyone do it individually?
That is up to everyone in this call. I think there's some value in forcing some breakout rooms, even if it's just to chat a little bit and break up the lecture. So since I'm in control, how about we do some breakout rooms for the next, let's say, how long do you need to go through it?
I would say it's a fairly easy case, so maybe 15 minutes, and then
Okay.
that'll leave a little bit of time to go over the answer.
Okay, I'm going to put you all into breakout rooms. You're going to be reading the South Street case study in the deep dive case book, which you'll find over in the chat. If you're unable to access that, maybe you can rely on your partners. I'll be sending all of this information out in email after the event today, including an answer key. But we're going to meet in breakout rooms until 3:45, and then we'll reconvene at 3:45, and Corey will walk us through inputting this information into the NDC spreadsheet. All right. Off you go. Welcome back. Everyone's filtering back from their breakout rooms. Corey is going to walk us through this, but as a heads up, in that same case book, in the back are the answers, which is really awesome. Some of you found it. Some of you found it, some of you did not. But that's another great way to follow along. All right, I think we are all back. I'm going to drop these into the chat again, and again, I'll be sending all of this documentation out in the wrap-up email as well. All right, take it away, Corey.
All right. So hopefully everyone can see my screen side by side. So I've got the South Street apartment case to the right and the spreadsheet to the left. There is a nice little spot here where I can put the name of the project. And then I want to start filling in my costs. So I have building acquisition of $300,000 and land acquisition of $90,000. Oops, $90,000. So for those of you that are not familiar with the way that the spreadsheet works, you'll notice that as I put in numbers into the unshaded cells, they carry across. And what this is meant to represent is if the cost qualifies under a specific program, it'll show up under that column. So the building acquisition is depreciable and it's eligible for the LIHTC acquisition credit. However, land qualifies for no programs. We have some renovation costs here of $3 million. We have new construction of $100,000. Well, where's that from? An elevator will be constructed as a building addition to the rear of the building to increase accessibility. So because it's a building addition, that's considered new construction. And you also notice that new construction does not qualify for the historic rehabilitation tax credits because it's not rehabilitation, it's new construction. We have architecture and engineering of $180,000. Now, here's also something interesting. When you follow this row across, right, my cost is $180,000. $180,000 then is eligible under my depreciable basis, but only $174,000 is eligible under my historic RTC basis. And that is because I have some new construction here and some rehabilitation. So what the computer has done is, or what the spreadsheet has done is that it divides the cost by this fraction. So only $174,000 of this $180,000 A&E fee can be counted towards the my qualified rehabilitation expenses. Similarly, with construction financing, that could go under really any of these categories, but we'll just put it under construction interest, $90,000. Similarly, again, for my historic rehab tax credit basis, I only get to count 87,000 of that. And then I also have a developer fee of 375,000. And again, only part of that's going to be countable. Operating reserves are down at the bottom. And operating reserves are basically money that you've put into a savings account. So those don't qualify for depreciation. They're not amortizable. They're not eligible for the rehab tax credit, and they're not eligible for either of the LIHTC programs. So now once I take the money out of the operating reserve, I may be using it at that point for a tax advantage use, but simply putting the money into a savings account is not a tax advantage expenditure. So my total expenditures should be $4,210,000, and indeed I've accomplished that on my development cost. A local bank has committed to providing a first mortgage of $2,550,000, but the CDC must arrange the rest of the financing. So here I can put my $2,550,000 under bank loan committed. But in doing so, I have to be sure to change E31 above and make that into a 1. So the 1 tells the system to look for the loan amount based on the amount. If I had a 2 in here, it'd be basing the loan amount simply on the DCR. If I have a 3, it will take the lesser of the DCR and the loan to value ratio, and it'll choose the lower of the 2. So that's right now all the information I have. I don't have an interest rate or amortization period. So how much additional money must the CDC raise to complete the project? Well, their total development cost was $4,210,000. They've raised $2,550,000 through a bank loan, so they still have to raise $1,660,000. Is the project likely to be eligible for rehabilitation tax credits? What challenges may they face in terms of compliance with the Secretary of Interior standards? So let's take on the first question. Why is the project likely to be eligible for the RTCs? Well, it's likely to be eligible for the RTCs because famous blues bassoonist Buster Rhyme Grimes has lived in the building for 35 years. And so that's its claim to fame. The building is, also more than 50 years old, which helps, But the thing that really does it is that it's associated with a significant person. What challenges may they face in terms of the compliance with the Secretary of Interior standards? Probably the biggest one, other than Windows, which is always, one to be concerned about, but that is the building addition. So they're planning on installing an elevator to, as a building addition to the rear of the building to increase accessibility. So, that improves the economic functioning of the building. So that's a good thing, but we want to be sensitive. We want to be careful about where we place it. So certainly it's better to put the elevator at the rear of the building rather than the front facade of the building, number one. Number two, we probably want that elevator to look distinctly modern, right? So that's not creating a false sense of history. And we want to make it in such a way that it can be removed easily if we ever needed it to be removed. What is the maximum amount of federal RTCs for which the project could qualify for? And remember that you cannot get the RTC on any new construction. Well, the nice thing is that the development budget already excludes stuff related to new construction. So the maximum amount of federal RTCs that we qualify for, well, in order to calculate that, I have to go back to my sources of funds tab. And over here in column J, I need to tell the system that I'm eligible for historic rehabilitation. So I need to change this from a 0 to a 1. And now, if I go to my tax and appreciation benefits tab, that's going to show me some information on the historic tax credit. And that's right here, rows 28 through 36. So my eligible cost of the $4.2 million, what's eligible is $3.6 million. If I had any non-RTC basis items that I had to exclude for some reason, I could put that here. Nothing's said in the case, so we can ignore that. The federal credit's a 4% credit that you get for 5 years, so it's a 20% total credit. So I'm eligible for $724,839 of historic tax credits. If an investor was willing to invest 81 cents for every dollar of tax credits, how much equity can the CDC raise? So for that, I'm going to go back to my sources of funds tab. And just below where I put a 1 to tell the system that I am doing a federal historic rehabilitation, I can tell the system that my investor is willing to give me 81 cents for every dollar of credit. And now if I go back to my tax and appreciation benefits, here in C36, I should be able to raise approximately $587,000 of equity. So what is the remaining financing gap? Well, I can go back to my sources of funds tab and the equity now shows up here on C52. So now I have total sources of 3.1 million. So my original development cost was 4.2 million. I've raised 3.1 million. So I have a gap of $1,072,000. And then question 5, the state of Nebraska has a state historic credit of 20%. I believe it's actually 25% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures. The same investor is willing to invest 73 cents for every dollar of state credits. How much can be raised through the state historic tax credit? So back here looking at column J, there's the Nebraska Historic Rehab assumptions. So I need to tell the system that put in a 1 here. I am taking the state historic tax credit, and my investor is willing to pay 73 cents for the state credit. So how much will that raise? I can look at my tax and appreciation benefits, and that's over here. So Nebraska does have a max of $1 million. So the historic tax credits, well, how much can be raised through historic tax credits? Well, I'm going to raise about $529,000 from the historic tax credits. And so is there a remaining gap? How can we fill it? So let's take a look at back to our sources of funds tab. If we go down to our gap area, now our equity is up to 1.1 million, making our total sources about 3.7 million, which means that we have a gap of $543,860. How can we fill it? Well, there's a few ways that we could try to fill it. One is that we could defer some developer fee, right? The developer's getting $375,000 of developer fee. If they let some of it back into the project, that might raise some money. The other thing, and we have to see if your building configuration would allow this to work, but if we could actually, if we could put the elevator inside the envelope of the building, rather than having it as a building addition, then our rehabilitation would then be 3.1 million. We'd get the historic tax credits on the new construction, and we get it on 100% of the A&E, 100% of the developer fee, 100% of the construction interest. So it wouldn't raise a ton of money, but it would definitely help save our gap. Now, if we're having to take out a unit in order to do that, it's probably better to have that residential unit and have it generate income to the project. But let's say that there was just some odd space in the building where we could actually fit an elevator. That may be the better way of going. We could also try to, we don't know what underwriting criteria the bank used to come to this $2.5 million loan. So I'd want to take a look to see if, maybe that I can search around for a bank that will give me a higher loan. Same thing with the tax credits themselves. I can shop this around. Just as Ryan said, sometimes, the big national players have big national law firms with big national law firm bills. So if I can find maybe a local investor willing to invest the money, then I may be able to get a higher price or lower cost with that. So that's it for my case study. There are 2 other case studies in the book. Bone is really all about figuring out how large of a loan you should be able to get. So it kind of addresses that first issue that I talked about. And then the Bach Apartments is a full case in which you're putting in residential rents, you're putting in commercial rents, and you're looking at the project comprehensively. So it's definitely a more advanced case. But all of the case study answer keys are attached at the end of the case. And so, for example, with South Street Apartments, all of those answers are right here. So are there any questions about the case or about my lecture notes?
Hey, Corey, this is Sonia. I have a question for you.
Sure.
When you said when you're short on funds, for example, the elevator, you could include that on the overall cost. Is that a decision you make? I mean, why wouldn't you do that from the beginning, I guess?
Well, it really depends on the configuration of your building. Right. So if I lose a whole apartment in order to put the elevator in, then the loss of income
Okay.
is going to be far greater, right? So sometimes you just, from a configuration standpoint, you end up having to do a building addition. There's no way around it.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions for Corey? Well, thanks to those of you who stuck with it to the end. Corey, they're all going to expect the answer keys in the back of the book from now on. I hope you know that.
Well, we'll try to accommodate that.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for attending today. Thank you, Corey and
Thank you.
Ryan. It was a joy to see you all. Have a wonderful day, and we'll catch you hopefully at the next deep dive where we meet in person at the Fabric Lab. Check out our website to register. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.